Get your collective together and let's get into this week's
Initial Codes. Part 1. Initial Codes. Part 1. Initial Codes.
Greetings, Trek nerds. We're here again to talk about the penultimate 9th episode of Picard's second season, Hide and Seek. I've got a French dungeon full of spoilers if you'd like to skip the torture rack now. Narratively, this episode is wonderful. It finally pays off a ton of the story and in unexpected ways, while still leaving us with the big mystery of how the crew is going to get back to the 25th century. However, almost every fight scene feels hokey, unbelievable, and our heroes are left with easy avenues of escape, despite impossible odds throughout the entirety of the run. We're dropped into the Borg Queen beaming herself and her new collective to La Sirena and the surrounding chateau area. Her Royal Borginess 2 of 1 assimilates the Borg Queen attire off her dead counterpart. But upon arrival, I guess Rios, Ramirez, and Ricardo aren't perceived as a threat and are able to leave the ship without incident, which is my first dislike of the episode. Talon soon uses her transporter to get a wounded Rios, the doctor, and her son back to her apartment. While Seven and Raffi take the long way through the chateau and vineyard, Picard conveniently remembers the entrance to the already mentioned underground tunnels. Which leads me to the second dislike. Why in a team of Borg super soldiers is Professor Plum the one to figure out where the secret passage to the conservatory is? I'm just going to get most of my dislikes out of the way early. This next one for the hokey fight scene with Picard using an old German Luger against the team of Borg Special Forces. He kills one of them, and they barely press on to get him. Though as Soong says at the end, why not just wait for the mice to run the maze? Which I have yet another dislike for. The whole running through the dungeon thing literally nets the overall plot nothing, except Picard's mom's backstory, which I'll get back to in a minute. Pretty much all of the action in the story is for the sake of action and little else. Which ends with this cliché Bond villain meeting, and his plans are ultimately foiled for now. One more dislike to get out of the way before I start building this really solid episode back up. When Agnes of Borg saves Seven's life by assimilating her, why does she regain only the Borg tech left in her from the Prime universe? And it materializes awfully fast. We don't see these other assimilated soldiers with ocular implants. I'm going to give the first like for Jurati splitting and having more conversations with herself. This like is really for her entire performance in seemingly her final episode. Now, we might find at the end of this, Q or something they do will set everything right. Jurati will be back to touring with Soji, and Elnor will be whole again. But we'll see. My next like is for an offshoot of the first, and it's literally for the Borg Queen crying bull. When Trek can swear tastefully like this, it's totally worth the MA rating. I almost want to give a like for bringing Elnor back as a hologram. I was thinking, hey, the Romulan warrior nun finally has something useful to do. Except, in the end, he fails in the single task that is his programmed existence. The Queen still gets La Sirena in the end, but it was fun to watch him go through the armory and wield his sword again. I've got a like for Seven after almost 2 full seasons finally name-dropping Janeway. You know, the woman that molded and shaped her. Seven wanted to join Starfleet, and despite Janeway making an empty threat to resign over it, she was denied because she still has enough Borg in her to be a liability. This piece goes a long way towards explaining how Seven got from the confident former Borg at the end of Voyager to the rebel without a cause we've seen in the run of Picard. I've got a like for what's probably the last on-screen bit of Teresa and Cristobal's romance plot. She starts laying out that this may be a predestination paradox for Rios, and he seems like he's about to lay out his feelings for her as the smoke transporter takes him back, which is one of the best goodbyes in TV history. He's beamed out just in time to foil the bad guy and see the Confederation version of his ship fly off into the sunset. Poor Chris. He just lost everything he loved in a few minutes of screen time. I've got a like for Agnes convincing the Queen part of her that maybe it's time to try a new way to Borg. The two of them go forth into the galaxy to create an all-volunteer collective with the goal of creating a Borg Benevolent Association. More than that, we get an interesting piece of lore about the Borg in other universes, that ultimately the Borg are self-defeating and end up destroyed in most universes eventually. And maybe rather than trying the same thing over and over, the logical Borg thing should be to try something different. The biggest piece of closure we get in this episode is the story thread about Picard's mom when he was young. I've got a like for the way this absolutely tragic plot plays out to an end. Apparently his mom hung herself, and Jean-Luc was at least partly to blame. After her game of hide-and-seek, with him in the tunnels under the chateau, his father locked her in a safe place for her and others' protection. Young Picard lets his mother out, and she committed suicide later, only for him to find her. A tragedy many people would walk away to keep from feeling the guilt. This goes a long way towards the character we see in the first season of TNG. He's a kind of stern, by-the-book starship captain. It's not till he starts building camaraderie and more tragedy happens to him that he starts becoming more human over the course of the series. Speaking of the early days of TNG, the only real callback in this episode is to his mother's only other appearance in Where No One Has Gone Before. We find out that despite her dying fairly young, Picard would imagine her getting old and having tea together to help alleviate his guilt over her death. I've got a general like for the episode, because while it has some mostly minor issues, this is setting us up much better than any penultimate episode in the modern iterations of Trek. We've answered a ton of the season's questions while still leaving a few big ones heading into the final episode. Now that the two people we thought were going to be the Borg Queen from the first episode, in either Jurati or Picard's mom, are gone, there's only one person left to maybe be who we saw then. Picard's ancestor Rene. I had thought earlier in the season when she said look up to Jean-Luc, that maybe there was an outside chance she was who we were going to see. The Borg Queen's final words for Picard are that there needs to be two Renes and one has to die, seem to be pointing directly to that. How are our remaining heroes going to get home without a ship? Join me next week for when we find out on the same day that Strange New Worlds premieres. I'm not crazy about doing two reviews in the same day, but I'm pumped for both the conclusion of Picard and the start of Captain Pike's Boldly Going. Until then, I've been your host, Dustin Wing.